Welcome back to Restless. I'm Father Joseph Gill, priest of the Diocese of Bridgeport, Connecticut, coming to you out of Monroe, Connecticut. And there's Joe over there, coming to you out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Through
Ambler,
the
Pennsylvania.
Ambler, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Where is that in relation to Philadelphia? Is that north, south?
Yeah, it's north. It's actually 20 minutes closer to our home diocese. So
Oh, okay. Okay.
it's it's north. It's a little bit north of Philly there. So,
Nice. Did not know that. Very
yeah,
cool.
well, you know.
So that's the magic of technology is that we can continue to record Restless even though we're separated by 4 states. And so thanks be to God for that. Very cool. If you count New Jersey as a state, but no.
3 states and 1 sovereign nation.
so they think. Anyway, speaking about sovereign nations, that's actually a great segue. Thanks for bringing that up. The segue is into our topic today, which is something that's been very much in the news lately, which is immigration and the Catholic view on immigration, because there's been a lot of ink spilled, pixels written, and people who have perhaps even lost friendships over the nature of immigration. And I posted something on Facebook probably back in early January, and it got some very vociferous responses, both positive and negative. And I was trying to present the church's teaching. I hope I did so accurately. I don't know what your thoughts were. Did you read what I said?
I did read what you said. There has been several weeks, and my memory is not particularly good.
Well,
So,
it was essentially hopefully striking the middle ground between those who say we should just let every immigrant in and have no borders whatsoever, and those who take the opposite extreme and say now we have to kick everybody out and make them all come through legally. Because I do think there is a middle ground there, and that middle ground is to reform immigration law such that those who are here illegally will quickly become citizens. And just in my own research, I was finding out that in order to become a citizen in the United States, depending on where you come from, so first you have to get a green card, which could take anywhere to 18 months, somewhere 24 months. But then, like, for example, those who are immigrating from Mexico have often a 20-year waiting period before they are allowed to become citizens. So this idea of, well, let's just, make everybody go through legally, frankly, for some people, they would be dead by that point. And 2, I'm considering and remembering, just in my own research, the ways in which Ellis Island operated, which were kind of interesting. Because when you came on a ship, you came without papers from the old country, whether it was Ireland, Italy, Germany, Netherlands, all kinds of places. So there's no papers, there's no visas, there's no immigration. The only thing you had to do was generally wait around for 3 to 5 hours to get your papers from the United States and have a medical exam, make sure that you're not bringing disease into this country. And then you are left free. Like, go ahead, you're here, you're a citizen, you're legal. And, so people were like, well, just, come in like my ancestors. Well, we don't have that anymore,
Right.
so, but the Pope, I know, spoke into this situation, kind of criticizing our vice president, and so things got very messy. So first, tell me, because you've done probably more research than I have. I went to the Catechism, but really haven't dove deeper than that. Regarding the church teaching on immigration, what would you say? How do you sum that up, Joe?
Yeah, so I found a useful resource from the USCCB on this, and they lay out 3 principles that they want Catholics to consider. So the first is that people have the right to migrate to sustain their lives and the lives of their families, and so that we see that kind of sprinkled throughout the Gospels, right? So one thing they cite is the rich man condemned in Luke's Gospel for not helping the poor man Lazarus. I think also we might consider the Good Samaritan, and that'll come up later in our discussion of J.D. Vance.
Yes, it will. Yes, it will.
His papal slap down, if you will. So yeah, so people have a right, and I think what that means is that I don't think what that's trying to say is that people have like the unmitigated right to move for a better life or something like that, kind of full stop, right? Because there might be people who are safe in their home and might be better off in America, but I don't think that necessarily entitles them to migrate.
It's true.
But conversely, someone who is not safe in their home because of for political reasons, and we always think of South America, but I mean, and again, I'm gonna mention this more later, but to take for example, people in Afghanistan who for 20 years helped fight with Americans as interpreters and whatnot. I mean, they are not safe in their home, and so they do have. We would recognize a right on their part to migrate. So that's principle number 1. Just quickly, principle number 2. country has the right to regulate its borders and to control immigration.
Hmm.
Um, one thing I really want to underscore from this one, and I thought this was very interesting and well put by the USCCB. Um, by this principle, the church recognizes that most immigration is ultimately not something to celebrate. And that's very counterintuitive to the way Americans
Hmm.
think of immigration. But the point the USCCB is making is that while we want to be welcoming to those who have to leave their home for one reason or another, we should actually be working towards a situation in which people do not need to do that, specifically because of how destabilizing it is for them, for their lives, the lives of their family, for their communities. It's the church would say it's actually some sort of something bad has happened that leads someone to need to leave their home to go somewhere they know no one.
Well,
I think
that's a great point.
very, yeah, I
That's
think
a
that's
great
very
point. I mean,
well taken. Yeah,
and it's something that's not often asked in this immigration debate is, why are they leaving? What is the cultural situation, whether it be financial,
yeah.
economic, or even safety, of why they feel this burning necessity?
Exactly, yeah. And just one more point on that, the USCCB says, and I think that sometimes this is one principle in which we're not great at appreciating. For this reason, Catholics should not view the work of the federal government and its immigration control as negative or evil. And I do think sometimes anytime immigrations and customs enforcement or any administration takes any action to more strictly enforce immigration law, sometimes there is a reaction, even from bishops. Sometimes that's like very reflexively um, critical of that. And I just think like if we're going to say that countries have a right to enforce their borders and police immigration, that has to mean something on the ground, you know?
Hmm. Absolutely, I agree. Yeah, and even in addition to like the illegal element of it, I mean, a nation has a right to preserve its own culture, which we're seeing more so in Europe when there's vast majorities of Islamic migrants coming in, which really kind of is watering down the very little Christianity that's left. I mean, there's kind of more of a sclerotic shell of Christianity, but even so, there's something there that at least has a kind of a Western mindset versus those who are coming in from North Africa or from the Middle East who will be just bringing in a different culture, and it's justified to say, is this the culture that we want our land to become?
Yeah, and also is uh is assimilation and integration of these peoples possible at these current numbers, right? So
Yeah.
there's a number of immigrants from anywhere that can be absorbed safely, but there's also a number of immigrants from anywhere that could not be absorbed safely. And I think sometimes it's not a question of being for or against as much as a question of saying, okay, fine, but like
Prudential judgment. Yeah.
prudentially, do we have a right and the ability to say this is too many people too fast, too soon type thing?
And I think different cultures have different views on that. So, for example, I spent 3 years at a Hispanic parish in Stanford, which I really enjoyed. But I found that the kids of the Hispanic immigrants want to be more American than Hispanic. So after first generation, a lot of them would lose their Spanish. They wouldn't speak Spanish very well. By two generations, they were as American as apple pie. And
Yeah.
so it was just kind of like a few cultural vestiges of having a quinceañera and this and that, versus perhaps those from a Islamic background who make a very concerted effort not to integrate and to assimilate. So yeah, I mean, I think you have to consider their background and whether or not assimilation is even a goal for those who are moving to a new country.
I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with that. Just so we don't miss it, just the third broad principle from USCCB, a country must regulate its borders with justice and mercy. And so this, I think, would be the interpretive
Mm.
key to synthesizing and harmonizing the other two principles, right? So how do we balance these comparative rights between the refugee and the immigrant and the host nation? Well, this is the answer. Um, yeah, so absolute equality of all people and the commitment to common good. Um, and this again, I think would call to mind the story of the Good Samaritan. So, and I think perhaps this might be, unless you have a comment on that, Father, a segue to JD Vance's because it's been 7 or 8 minutes, so I do feel that it's been enough time for me to attack JD Vance. Um,
I must admit, he brought up this idea of the ordo amoris, the order of love, that we love those closest to us before we start loving those more distant to us. And I've actually never, in my entire theological studies, ever come across that language of ordo amoris. but I do sympathize with and like the idea behind it. But it sounds like you don't. You really wanted to criticize.
Well, I'm not criticizing Odor Morris. I'm criticizing JD Vance. And I think that
I'm
yeah.
happy
So
to
my
say it
so
out loud.
so yeah. So it seems like well, okay. So JD Vance basically seemed to try to use this principle, which I also had never heard of, to defend the Trump administration's, I would say, pretty aggressive enforcement and deportation regime, and not just that, but also the Trump administration's pretty aggressive efforts to limit illegal immigration and also not legal immigration and refugee status. In some cases, pretty coercive tactics used in other nations. And the Holy Father, who I do think probably had heard of this prior to J.D. Vance's saying it, the Holy Father Pope Francis wrote a letter to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops about immigration and about how he kind of hopes they might handle the present moment in America. And he, in the sixth paragraph, he doesn't, the kids would call this subtweeting. Do you know what subtweeting is, Father?
I'm sorry, I'm not a millennial. Well, I am a millennial,
Nor am
but
I. Yeah, you are actually.
yeah.
Subtweeting is when you mention someone without mentioning their name. So
Mm.
some priests from Monroe have said, and that would be a subtweet because I'm not saying your name, but we all know
There's
who I'm
two of
talking
us.
about.
It could be my parochial
Yeah,
vicar. I don't know.
it could be.
So
And
the
so the
Pope
Holy,
kind of did that, kind of
so
like
he very much
somebody
did
from
that.
America talked about this without
Yeah,
saying their name. Yeah,
if I could quote this just a few sentences of this, it's a little bit at length, but
sure. Hmm.
actually, I'm just gonna quote the whole paragraph. It'll be quick. Christians, I talk fast, so just slow
Yeah,
it down
true.
if you need to. Christians know very well that it is only by affirming the infinite dignity of all that our own identity as persons and as community is reaching its maturity. Christian love is not a concentric expansion of interests that little by little extend to other persons and groups. In other words, the human person is not a mere individual, relatively expansive, with some philanthropic feelings. The human person is a subject with dignity who, through the constitutive relationship with all, especially with the poorest, can gradually mature in his identity and vocation. The true ordo amoris, subtweet, the true ordo amoris that must be promoted is that which we discover by meditating constantly on the parable of the Good Samaritan. That is, by meditating on the love that builds a fraternity open to all without exception. So, okay, so it seemed like my understanding what J.D. Vance is trying to say is that we have a high obligation to our family and to our friends, to our communities, to our nation than we do to others. And I think fine as far as it goes. But I think the Holy Father is pointing out that that does not mean that we only have charity at the, like whatever like trickle remains at the end of all of our relationships. Do we have any charity for anybody that finally maybe touches the immigrant? But rather, I think what the Holy Father is saying, balance these relationships and these priorities, sure, but you need to remember that the Good Samaritan was was the one who was a neighbor to the man whom he didn't know. Um, and that's an
It
important Christian
was
principle.
yes, and I don't disagree with that. I think there's a lot of truth there, and it's a wonderful parable to meditate upon. But I think when you have a limited amount of resources, and that's the issue, right? We don't have infinite amount of money as much as our government may want to keep printing it, right? There's a limited number of seats in a school. There's a limited number of hospital beds, and when you start just saying opening all the doors, you really stress out the system. And there's a limited amount of hours in the day, right? So, for example, if I'm a father of a family, right, and I've got to work for a living, and I've got to come home, well, I've got some choices with what I'm going to do with my spare time, the 5 hours that I have between coming home and going to bed. I could play with my kids. I could love my wife. I could also leave my kids and my wife and serve the poor. Now, in a perfect world, we could balance both, balance all of them. But as I have a very limited resource of time, 5 hours, I've got to choose as to what my vocation, what my calling is. And my calling is first and foremost to the people around me. So I think that's the point that JD Vance is making, regardless of whether or not you like him as a person or as a politician. But I think that's a good point, is that, okay, so let's look around at the major problems we have in America before we start trying to take care of the problems in other countries, which I know we have not done well as a country. We've kind of stuck our fingers in a lot of pies. But
Yeah, I also just think that's not. I'm trying to see because the bishops had a good line on something like that, but um, from what I was reading, it's really not permissible for a nation to just say, "Well, we're going to deal with only our problems without concern for the lives of those who live outside our borders." I mean,
no, of
it
course not.
seems,
But
yeah,
it's a balance, right? it's a balance. I mean,
Yes, it's
do
a
we
balance.
we have a lot of issues here at home, right? We've got a fentanyl crisis. We've got rising inflation. We have 1,000 things that need to be really kind of cared for. And I know we live in a globalized society, so some of that will impact all of these things. But
Yeah, I just think that sometimes, I mean, America will always have problems. So by that, like, you know what I mean? So that's not what you're doing, but that could very easily be used to justify just never doing anything to help anybody, right? I mean, because the reality is there's always going to be something. By the way, tariffs are inflationary.
they are. No, I
So,
don't. I don't disagree. I don't disagree with you
so
on that.
I think, can I just make a couple of my own points?
You
First
may.
of all, I think
I
as
may
regards to,
disagree, but you may.
yeah, well, that's fine. Although I suspect probably not. Here's one thing. I always remember my first year in seminary, we went to a Norbertine, whatever, the abbey, and the abbot was preaching. And right around this, either Greg Abbott or Ron DeSantis, I can't remember which, had announced that they were going to start busing illegal immigrants elsewhere in the country. And they chose Martha's Vineyard. And this was a sort of cynical political ploy to like whatever. But what was interesting to me was that the Abbott's take was, well, this is clear. I mean, busing immigrants to Martha's Vineyard is clearly not hospitality. And I had to kind of smirk to myself because um I've never been to Martha's Vineyard. I hear it's lovely. I suspect that Barack Obama doesn't vacation there because it's not. And so I just wonder if
I've been there once. I
sometimes,
will say it's not as bougie as I thought it was going to be.
fine, but it's probably nicer than where these people are coming from. And so I just wonder if perhaps, so here's my point basically. Why am I bringing this up? I think that whichever governor it was who had this policy, one point that is worth making is like just because you're not a border state doesn't mean you shouldn't feel the brunt of this. In other words, if you want to vote for increased immigration and you live in Vermont, well then God bless America, then you should be experiencing some of that illegal immigration or some of that legal whatever it is. So I do think that all states should be equally sharing the burden of this, not just border states. And I think that border states have a case to make when they say, "Well, look, I mean, we are the ones overrun, and you're as far away as you can be from the Mexican border, and
Well,
you're saying
you don't
how wonderful this is."
you don't even have to talk about states. I mean, right here in our own state of Connecticut, it made me laugh and cringe at the same time that I would drive through places like New Canaan, Wilton, Weston, these extremely Greenwich, these extremely wealthy, bourgeois enclaves, and every house would have one of those "hate has no home here,"
Yeah, yeah. So yeah,
posters out front.
but do immigrants? But do
But
immigrants?
do
Yeah,
immigrants, right? I mean, nobody. Of course, you can easily from an ivory tower
yeah,
say, "Oh yeah, let's
right,
welcome all the immigrants," when you don't
yeah,
have them, when you don't have immigrants next door, right? It's very different when
right.
you live in downtown Stanford and facing some of the issues that we face. I mean, to be honest, I love the parish when I was at the Hispanic parish, but there were definitely some real challenges. One of which was um, the totally different cultural mindset led to some really strange stuff. Like I remember we had this big argument at youth group because some of our 13-year-old kids would drive themselves to youth group. And I was like, "What are you guys doing? You're 13 years old driving on a road." They're like, "Yeah, my dad did that in Guatemala. It's no big deal." Like, no,
Right,
it is a big, that's like a huge
right.
deal, right? So this
No
idea of like,
estás in Guatemala.
this idea of like, no, you have to like obey the laws of this country, like what it wasn't getting through. And I'll tell you, when the rectory was on a very busy road in
Yeah, I
downtown
remember.
Stanford,
Yeah,
on Elm Street, and across the street would be people playing mariachi music till 2 a.m. every single weekend night of the year until Trump got elected. And as soon as Trump got elected, it was shut off at 10 p.m. And
yeah,
my takeaway was, like, it's so interesting that there's people that are really advocating for it, for this increased no holds barred immigration,
right. Don't
don't
feel the brunt
live
of
in
it.
a
Yeah.
Hispanic enclave where there's sometimes the culture and the laws are not being respected of the country. That's not
Yeah,
everywhere, and there's not
right.
everyone.
No, but I think that if we're going to accept illegal immigrants, legal or illegal, there should be efforts. Illegal immigrants, I mean, they choose where they settle, I guess. But if we're gonna be taking in, let's say, a lot of refugees at the border, for example, yeah, I think that all 50 states have an obligation to share that burden, right?
Yeah,
Because it's not
absolutely.
otherwise it's totally unfair. And relevant to that point,
Which means there has to be
um,
affordable housing in these towns like New Canaan and other towns that,
yeah, or yeah,
yeah.
or some version of that. Um, relevant to this point, you're not really a refugee if you've passed through a safe harbor country. So in other words, if you were a refugee from somewhere further in South America and you could feasibly live in Mexico and you choose not to, I don't know how much you really are a refugee when you come to America. I think there's arguments to be made there. And I think that, like, to swing back to Mr. Trump for a moment here, um, ideally, those countries to the south of us are our allies in this fight, not our enemies. And so, you know, his ridiculous, like this kerfuffle with Colombia with the Colombian president and imposing 25% tariffs on Mexico,
Sure.
all this nonsense, and getting them to concede to things they already conceded to a year ago, and all this stuff. It's counterproductive, right? Because what America, ideally, like the best immigration policy America could have would be a stable, well governed Mexico to the south of us. That would solve 90% of our problems. No, seriously.
Yeah,
Like,
true, true. Make that the
imagine
place we want to go.
right. Imagine if Canada was a mess, right? We benefit more than we realize having a stable partner with the North. So I just think that,
Yeah.
and I personally would be willing to spend a lot of money as a nation to try to help these countries become more stable and better governed.
Yes, but the
Um,
challenge, I don't think the money is the main issue.
no, I know. I'm just saying,
There's a
like in
lot of,
theory, I would
yeah,
be.
in
I
theory.
think that,
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely. Whatever
if we're
it
a nation
takes.
building, I guess what I'm saying. I think that might be a good place to start. And just finally, I know I'm sorry, I'm kind of monologuing here, but there's a difference between refugees and immigrants. Um, Donald Trump's some of his new immigration stuff, um, is going to make it more difficult for those Afghan interpreters who for 20 years fought to liberate their country from the Taliban, to whom Joe Biden and Donald Trump together cowardly surrendered it. For which we'll see. But so those people are now going to die, probably,
Right.
and that's because of one man's lack of an ability to draw distinctions and to understand, but not just him. I mean, the whole country. I mean, there's a distinction between letting in people from Mexico and letting in people from Cuba or from Venezuela, right? I mean, it's just reality. So I think we need to be able to draw these distinctions. So anyway, that's the
Sure.
end of my
Sure.
rant. What do you think about all this?
Well, I think the question we have to ask ourselves is that, the reality is we have at least 11 million, if not more, undocumented immigrants here in this country. And so the question for me is, well, what can be done? What should be done about that? And I think the middle ground for me personally would be the right answer. So, I mean, we have a number of who have parents who are undocumented, and they were, birthright citizenship. And I've talked to a lot of them, and of course they want to stay because they've never known life in Mexico. They've never known life in Colombia,
Right.
wherever they're from. So what can be done now? I think the question is the answer is not to deport everyone, because statistically, interestingly enough, I mean, the immigrant population actually has a lower rate of crime than the native-born population, which is kind of interesting. So a lot of people are like, well, they're all criminals, but that's statistics doesn't bear that out. So, I mean, my advocacy would be to find a way for those who have been in this country 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, make your limit wherever you want, to find a way to quickly and safely make them citizens of this country, whether that requires a test in English, whether that requires a background check, a fine, whatever. Because I think there's two ways in which somebody can stop being illegal, stop breaking the law. You can remove them from the country, or you can change the law.
Right.
That's my issue.
Yeah.
When I drive, I can either slow down, or I can ask the governor to change the speed limit.
Right. The correct option.
Right.
I also, like, people complain about the drain on resources, and one solution to that might be to, I don't know, integrate these people into the tax system, right? So they help fund the resources that are being spent on other, on their own communities.
Very much so. Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. I also, again, I just like to reiterate your point that an authentically Catholic immigration policy does not separate families. And I'm not talking about the border separation stuff, because that's a very complicated legal question with all sorts of court rulings. I'm talking about, like, the idea of deporting the parents of kids who are naturalized citizens here. I mean, that's like not a Catholic immigration policy.
I agree with one caveat, and the caveat is that it is a real thing that people will come over when they're pregnant to get the anchor baby. And that's a very real problem. So maybe the solution is to remove birthright citizenship. So that
I mean, the problem is that, I actually I'm very open to this idea, and I'm open to the idea that the civil right that the oh my goodness, 14th Amendment, oh boy, 14th Amendment is being 14th.
What amendment are you talking about? I don't know which one.
The one that birthright citizenship comes from.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know where that comes from.
So the idea is that, hang on, this is embarrassing because I'm a legal nerd.
Can you believe this guy has a poli-sci degree? He doesn't know the amendments.
I know, it's embarrassing.
It's all right. If you asked me about philosophers, I would know that from my philosophy bachelor.
Okay, yeah. So basically, these are post-Civil War amendments, and they're trying to draft these amendments so that the fact that freed slaves weren't citizens doesn't mean that South take away their rights, and so they include this language about those persons born born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and that's where the birthright citizenship debate comes from. My
Hmm.
point is only that it's a constitutional question. I'm open to the idea that it needs to be renegotiated,
But I
not
think
by executive order,
one of
or by
one
tweet.
one of the more interesting things is that Europe doesn't have such a thing. Most other countries don't. It's a very uniquely American.
Yeah, so
Um,
there does raise an interesting question, which is okay. So we get rid of it, and then if somebody is born here, well, to what country do they belong? Because their home country may not claim them. And so, yeah, I'm open to the idea that this needs to be looked at.
that's a good question. Yeah,
Um,
I don't know the answer to that.
this is just let's just be honest for a second, though. It'd be a nice change of pace for this, I guess.
Please.
The reality is that these problems are actually very simple to solve in some ways, which is that um, like the correct like what inevitably needs to happen would be like you said some sort of pathway to citizenship for most, deportation for those who are dangerous in one way or another, and then tighter immigration because the border as it exists with this like come one come all mentality is a total humanitarian disaster. It leads to drug trafficking, it leads to human trafficking. It's just awful, 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 awful. And so we want to be saying no, don't come illegally. We want to be enforcing those laws, and we want to be compassionate to those who are already here. But that solution is it won't happen because then Republicans and Democrats can't run on the issue. So
Hmm.
both parties have a vested interest in not solving it, which is why Donald Trump killed immigration policy before he was even president again
Do
by
you
telling
feel like
Republicans not to vote for it. And
that's
Democrats
interesting?
do the same thing over and over again.
That's interesting. Do you think that's kind of similar to abortion in that abortion will never be resolved in our country because it's the dividing
Um,
issue, and this too has become the dividing issue between the two
I think
parties.
it's dissimilar in that Republicans are Republican. Okay, it's similar when Roe v. Wade was still in place, right? Because Republicans could run on abortion without knowing they never had to do anything on abortion, and their votes never mattered, so they could kind of run to the base and not worry about the repercussions. Now that they actually have to live with the consequences of their votes, Republicans are suddenly very squishy on the issue.
Mm,
And so I'd say it's
that's fair.
dissimilar in that way. I think both sides really are politically helped. I mean, Trump can say they're invading. There's a caravan. Send down the military who aren't allowed to do law enforcement anyway because of posse comitatus. And the Democrats can say, how dare he? He's racist because he's deporting people just because they're here illegally. And it goes on and on and on. And they can raise a ton of money off of it and get a lot of votes off of it, which is why it'll never be solved.
Mm, that's
So
fair. That's fair.
sorry for my cynical take, but that's the poli sci major finally coming out after he forgot the 14th. It is the 14th Amendment, by the way. I don't know why I blanked on that or
Oh,
why I
that's
flinched
fair.
on
That's
that.
fair.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think there are definitely financial interests that financial and political interests that are not interested in solving a lot of problems in today's world. So it's a sad reality. I don't think it's cynical. I think it's pretty realistic, to be honest.
Okay.
But I think in the last couple minutes that we have, I think it's important though to talk about though how do we treat and integrate the immigrants in our own community. And I really do think my life has been very much blessed by the immigrants that I do know who really took on a lot to sacrifice for their family, especially for their kids, to have kids here in this country, and I'm very grateful to know them. And my life's been very enriched by going to quinceañeras and experiencing the food and the culture of particularly Hispanic. That's kind of the only culture I've really gotten to know. But I don't know. Have you had a lot of interaction with an immigrant community, and how should we, as Christians, really kind of
Yeah.
minister and be present to that community?
Yeah, I mean, not really an immigrant community with individual immigrants. So I can't really speak the way you can, but I think all I would say is that I think we should have patience with the generation that immigrates because I think we have this sort of like fantasy that like our ancestors who immigrated like learned English the next day. The reality is that in most cases, the generation that immigrates, particularly if they're older, never learn English.
Yeah.
They die
Hmm.
speaking Italian or
Which
French or
which
whatever they speak in Scotland.
in those days you didn't
You
have
know,
to because there were ghettos in New York City,
right.
other cities of Little
And this,
Italy,
right.
little Chinatown, and you don't have to
Exactly
learn it.
right. So I think we should just be patient and recognize that in a few generations, this people will be indistinguishable from us. And it's funny because a lot of times, like people get all worked up over like the Hispanic vote and whether they're voting for Democrats or Republicans. But the interesting reality, polling wise, is that the wealthier Hispanic groups become, the more they identify as white. So these identities are actually extremely flexible. If you had told my Italian family who immigrated here that they would one day be considered white, like I don't know, like an Irishman. I mean, they would have fallen out of their chair. I mean, that just wouldn't have crossed their
Right.
mind.
Right.
So yeah. So I just think just like a general like patience and compassion, and also this is not directly related to your question, but I forgot to say it before, so I want to say it now. Just a rejection of those cynical politicians who lie and who don't have any of these principles at heart.
Mm.
I do mean Donald Trump and JD Vance. And I would just like to take this opportunity that I've given myself to caution against the elevation of JD Vance as some sort of Catholic folk hero, because the number of questions on which he's opposed to the church, including the withdrawal of money to the withdrawal of grants that the USCCB was using to help immigrants, and this like
I
ridiculous.
don't disagree with that, but I think the USCCB is a waste of time and money. But
well,
I'm allowed to say that.
Well, but helping immigrants probably isn't, since it's like a moral obligation. And either way, I do think lying is still a sin. And so him just like making up that there's like this like fraud and embezzlement basically happening on the part of the USCB and these grants is totally fabricated and terrible. Not to mention like how difficult it'll be for foreign priests to get and seminarians to get visas.
Well, that's been a real challenge. I think a quarter of the priests of the Archdiocese of New York are foreign-born, and they're struggling now with the visa issue. Yeah, that's going to be a real challenge.
Just be careful with this Catholic folk hero, is all I'm saying, because it turns out
that's fair. But I mean, I won't get into criticizing any particular politician. I think there's mix of good and bad, and certainly better than some.
Sure, but these are the two most relevant right now.
Better than some we could have had, but I will say one thing that when I worked at the Hispanic parish, that it was kind of a blessing that I was not of the Hispanic background, because I noticed very strongly that when the younger generation became more American, they associated their faith with their culture, and there's like, oh, we're American now, we don't need to practice the faith. That's all like because there's a great lack of catechesis among the Hispanics that I worked with, in the sense that they knew they were Catholic. And they knew some kind of superstitions around their faith. They knew the processions. They knew the Virgin de Guadalupe. But in terms of like actually knowing the commandments, knowing how to pray, knowing what the Mass was all about, it was very foreign. So it was kind of a blessing that I was able to share with the young people that, look, you can be fully American and fully Catholic, fully passionate about the Lord. So it's not just something that you associate with your culture, because when culture and faith get intertwined, it's a good thing. But then when culture changes, does faith get left behind, right? So that's kind of an important thing for our immigrant communities to keep in mind as they help form their kids. Because I did see a lot of parents, they came here to give their kids a better life, but a lot of times they meant a materially better life.
Yeah.
So let's get the kid the smartphone. Let's get the kid into a good college. And the pressure was all on material success and not on, well, let's actually, dive deeper into our faith and become saints. So it's kind of just an interesting challenge, but also an interesting opportunity that I think the Catholic Church has in ministering to these communities, to kind of emphasize your faith is not your culture. It's informed by your culture, and your culture is informed by your faith, but the two are separate. So become American and deeply Catholic.
Yeah, so I like it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for this enlightening, and we'll see how controversial this gets episode. But it's a topical topic. It's something very present in our news cycle. So thanks for joining us on this episode of Restless. You can find us on Veritas Catholic Network, 1350 AM and 103.9 FM. So tune in next time to Restless.